Before we begin tonight's encounters, a brief transmission. This channel has now reached over 150 subscribers. To each of you who has chosen to listen, to follow these stories into the unknown, thank you. Your presence keeps this signal alive. Now, let us return back to tonight's scheduled transmission. Welcome. Tonight we explore 4 of the strangest alien abductions ever recorded. In rural China, a farmer claimed contact with beings from another world. In California, a lone hunter was pursued through the forest by something not human. Across the waters of Maine, 4 men were taken into a beam of light. And in Brazil, a farmer was drawn aboard a craft beneath a burning red sky. These are true UFO encounters, alien abductions that remain unexplained. In the summer of 1994, far from the crowded cities of China, the forested mountains of Heilongjiang province were quiet and remote. It was here, near the small village of Wuchang, that a man named Meng Zhaoguo lived and worked. He was a forestry worker, a man tied to the land and the rhythm of rural life. For him, the wilderness was not mysterious, it was familiar. He knew the trees, the sounds, the stillness. But that summer, Meng would claim to have experienced something so extraordinary, so far outside the bounds of ordinary reality, that it would follow him for the rest of his life. Meng's story began, he said, with a strange object that descended from the sky. From his vantage point in the hills, he spotted something metallic, something that seemed to shimmer against the green backdrop of the forest. At first, he thought it might be a helicopter, or perhaps a weather balloon. But as the object came closer, it appeared to move in ways no aircraft should. It glided, hovered, and finally dropped from view into the trees. Curious, Meng and a co-worker decided to investigate. The forest was dense and the climb was difficult, but as they approached the site where the object had fallen, they reported seeing a structure unlike anything they had ever encountered. Meng described it as large and metallic, reflecting the sunlight with a brilliance that seemed unnatural. It did not resemble any known machine. It stood silently in the clearing, humming faintly, pulsing as though alive. The 2 men felt a mix of awe and fear. Neither dared get too close. What followed over the coming days would defy all explanation. Meng claimed that during the nights after the initial sighting, he began to experience vivid disturbances. He spoke of strange lights that appeared outside his home, hovering silently in the night sky. He said that one evening he was pulled from his bed by an unseen force, transported not through physical means, but by something beyond his understanding. In his account, he found himself inside the craft. Inside, Meng reported the space was dimly lit, filled with a strange glow. He saw figures there, beings unlike any human, yet bearing humanoid forms. Their features were indistinct, blurred as though hidden behind veils of light. They did not speak with voices, but with thoughts that pressed directly into his mind. Among them was one figure he would describe in detail again and again over the years, a tall female being standing nearly 3 meters high, towering above him. Meng insisted that what followed was not a dream. He described physical contact with the being, an intimate experience unlike anything he had ever imagined. He claimed she communicated with him telepathically throughout, calming his fear, telling him not to resist. According to Meng, she explained that her people had been watching humanity for centuries. They were studying human development, learning, waiting for something. She told him that their fates, human and alien, were linked in ways he could not yet understand. Afterward, Meng claimed he was returned to his home. But the experience did not end there. He reported waking with unexplained injuries, bruises, scratches, and strange marks across his body. He experienced nosebleeds, headaches, and sudden bouts of unconsciousness. Most disturbing of all, he believed that something had been implanted inside him. He said he could feel a small, hard object beneath his skin, though later examinations would never confirm the presence of such a device. Word of Meng's story spread quickly. In a country where open discussion of UFOs was rare, his claims drew immediate attention. Local villagers whispered about him. Some dismissed him outright as a liar. Others avoided him altogether, wary of the strangeness surrounding his name. But soon the case reached the ears of the Beijing UFO Research Organization, one of China's largest civilian groups devoted to the study of unexplained aerial phenomena. Investigators traveled to Wuchang to meet Meng. They interviewed him extensively, recording his testimony and inspecting his body for evidence of the injuries he described. Some noted unusual scars and discolorations, but nothing that could conclusively prove his claims. They asked him repeatedly why he would invent such a story. Meng insisted he had no reason to lie. He gained no money, no fame. In fact, he risked ridicule and isolation by speaking at all. The researchers were divided. Some believed he was fabricating the story, influenced by Western tales of abductions and alien contact. Others, however, felt that his sincerity was undeniable. He recounted his experience in consistent detail across multiple interviews, never wavering, even under skeptical questioning. One investigator later remarked that Meng's emotion, his physical reactions, and his reluctance to publicize his claims all suggested he believed every word he was saying. Skeptics pointed out the most sensational element of his account, the description of intimacy with an extraterrestrial being. To them, this was evidence of fantasy, of a man caught between dream and reality. But others argued that dismissing such testimony outright ignored a broader pattern. Around the world, abductees had described strange medical procedures, hybrid experiments, and communications about the future of humanity. Perhaps, they suggested, Meng's bizarre account was simply another piece of a puzzle too vast to comprehend. Over time, the Meng Zhaoguo incident became one of China's most famous UFO cases. It was debated in newspapers, in scientific journals, and even in small government circles. Some officials expressed concern that the story reflected foreign cultural influence, that Meng had absorbed Western UFO lore and repackaged it as his own. Others quietly acknowledged that, fabricated or not, the account had ignited public curiosity about phenomena rarely discussed openly in China. For Meng himself, the experience never faded. He continued to insist on the truth of his encounter, even decades later. In interviews, he often expressed frustration that people did not believe him, but he also spoke calmly, without anger, as though he had resigned himself to disbelief. He said he knew what had happened to him, and that was enough. He claimed the beings had promised to return, though they never did. What remains most compelling about the case is not just the strange content of Meng's story, but the man himself. By all accounts, he was an ordinary worker, uneducated in matters of science or myth. He had no history of attention-seeking, no reputation for tall tales. To many, it seemed inconceivable that he would invent something so outrageous, knowing the mockery it would bring. And yet, the possibility of imagination cannot be dismissed. Human beings are capable of convincing themselves of extraordinary things, especially under stress, exhaustion, or the influence of dreams. Was Meng's encounter the product of a vivid hallucination? A sleep paralysis episode given shape by subconscious fears and cultural imagery? Or was it, as he claimed, a real visitation by beings from beyond our world? The truth is uncertain and perhaps unknowable, but the story endures, not just in China, but across the world, as part of the vast and enigmatic mosaic of human encounters with the unknown. For believers, the Meng Zhaoguo incident stands as proof that the UFO phenomenon does not belong to any one country or culture. It crosses borders, appearing wherever human beings live beneath the open sky. For skeptics, the case is a cautionary tale about the power of imagination and the persistence of myth. Yet, even the most skeptical cannot fully ignore the sincerity of Meng's testimony. In the stillness of the Heilianjiang forests, something extraordinary happened, whether in reality or only in the mind of one man. And the echoes of that event continue to ripple outward decades later, raising the same questions that haunt every UFO story. What truly happened that night? What did Meng encounter in the shadows of the mountains? And perhaps most haunting of all, was his experience a solitary delusion or a glimpse into a greater truth waiting still in the dark skies above? The Allagash waterway runs like a ribbon through the forests of northern Maine, a remote wilderness of deep lakes, rushing rivers, and endless trees. In August of 1976, 4 young men set out there for what was meant to be a simple camping and fishing trip. What they brought back was not fish, nor stories of hunting or canoeing, but one of the most chilling multiple witness abduction accounts in UFO history. The four men were Jim Weiner, his twin brother Jack, and their two friends, Charlie Foltz and Chuck Rock. They were in their 20s, outdoorsmen eager for adventure, and the Allagash River provided it in abundance. For days, their trip went as expected. They fished, cooked over open fires, and camped beneath the stars. But on the second night, something unusual appeared. Far above the treetops, they saw a bright object hovering in the sky. It was too large, too steady to be a star, and it seemed to pulse with light. At first, they thought it was a planet shining unusually bright, but it lingered, unmoving, for long minutes before finally gliding out of sight. They spoke of it only briefly, dismissing it as odd but nothing to fear. Several nights later, on August 20, the strangeness returned in a way none of them could ignore. They had camped along Eagle Lake, a broad, still body of water surrounded by dark pine forest. The night was warm, and the men decided to try their luck at night fishing. Paddling their canoes out onto the calm water, they carried only their gear, a flashlight, and the quiet confidence of men accustomed to the outdoors. It was Charlie who first noticed the light. Above the tree line, a brilliant glow appeared, spherical and intense. At first, it hovered silently, then began to move, slowly, deliberately, across the sky. They watched in awe as it shifted colors, from white to red to green, pulsing rhythmically like a living thing. Thinking quickly, Charlie raised his flashlight and signaled with it, flashing a pattern toward the object in hopes of receiving a reply. To their shock, the craft reacted. It stopped, hung still for a moment, and then began moving directly toward them. Panic erupted in the canoes. The light grew larger, brighter, bearing down on them with impossible speed. The men shouted, paddling frantically for the shore. The beam of light illuminated the water around them, casting the lake in an eerie glow. Charlie turned once to look back, and what he saw froze him. The glowing craft now hovered low, almost upon them, a massive presence blotting out the stars. Then, in an instant, everything went blank. The next thing they knew, they were standing on the shore. Their canoes were pulled up, the fire they had left burning was nearly out, and hours had passed. None of them could explain how they got there or why their memory had vanished. Confused and shaken, they tried to dismiss the incident as nothing more than a trick of fear and exhaustion. But deep down, each knew something far stranger had occurred. For years, the story might have ended there, a bizarre but unexplained sighting locked away in memory. But time would not let it rest. In the years that followed, the men began to experience troubling dreams. Jim Weiner, in particular, suffered from seizures after a head injury, and during medical treatment, his strange dreams of the Allagash resurfaced with startling clarity. He described being inside a room, cold and metallic, with glaring lights overhead. Figures surrounded him, beings unlike any human, with large heads, spindly limbs, and dark almond-shaped eyes. When Jim confided in his brother and friends, he discovered they had been experiencing the same nightmares. Each recalled flashes of memory, being taken from the canoe in a beam of light, being laid out on tables, examined by beings who communicated without words.
the fragments aligned too closely to be dismissed. Finally, they agreed to undergo hypnosis, hoping to uncover what lay hidden in the hours they had lost on the lake. Under hypnosis, their stories poured out in disturbing detail. Each of the four men described being lifted into the craft by a beam of light. They recalled narrow corridors, bright examination rooms, and instruments they could not understand. The beings worked silently, examining their bodies, taking samples of blood, tissue, even fluid from their eyes. The men remembered terror, the inability to move, and the cold detachment of their captors. Perhaps most chilling of all, their accounts matched with eerie precision. The details they described were consistent across each session. The layout of the craft, the appearance of the beings, the procedures performed. None of them had discussed these dreams in depth beforehand, and yet under hypnosis, their memories converged into a single story. Skeptics have long argued that hypnosis is unreliable, that memories can be implanted or distorted by suggestion. But those who studied the Allagash case noted the men's sincerity, their reluctance to seek publicity, and the uncanny alignment of their testimonies. For researchers, it became one of the most compelling multiple-witness abduction cases on record. In time, the story of the Allagash abduction spread beyond Maine, entering the broader lore of UFO history. It was studied by investigators, written about in books, and discussed at conferences. Some hailed it as proof that abductions were not isolated events, but shared experiences, witnessed and endured by more than one person at once. Others dismissed it as a mix of misremembered dreams and suggestibility. Yet what lingers is the image of four young men, alone on a wilderness lake, confronted by something vast and incomprehensible. Their experience was not just a fleeting sighting, but a night stolen from their lives, a gap filled only later by fragments of terror dredged from memory. For Jim, Jack, Charlie, and Chuck, the Allagash trip was meant to be a simple adventure into the quiet of the Maine woods. Instead, it became the defining moment of their lives, a story they could never escape, a truth they could never fully explain. The wilderness has always carried mysteries, and the Allagash forests are no exception. But for these four men, the darkness of Eagle Lake revealed not just the solitude of nature, but the possibility that humanity is no alone, and that those who watch us may sometimes step out of the shadows uninvited. To this day, the Allagash abduction remains one of the most famous and unsettling abduction cases in American history. For some, it is an elaborate tale, a product of imagination, fear, and the suggestibility of hypnosis. For others, it stands as one of the clearest examples of a shared encounter with the unknown, corroborated across four voices, four memories, and four lives forever changed. And like the ripples spreading across a still lake, its mystery continues to radiate outward, unresolved, unexplained, and unforgettable.
In the late summer of 1964, deep in the rugged wilderness of Northern California's Sierra Nevada mountains, a quiet camping trip turned into one of the strangest encounters ever recorded in UFO history. The story belongs to Donald Schrum, an ordinary man who found himself alone in the dark pine forest, facing beings that seemed neither human
nor entirely machine. What happened to him that night has been whispered about for decades, a bizarre and terrifying confrontation that blurred the line between myth and reality. Donald Shrum was 30 years old at the time, a civilian defense worker and an experienced outdoorsman. He and two friends had set out for a weekend of bow hunting in the forests near Cisco Grove, a remote region tucked along the interstate east of Sacramento. They carried only the essentials: bows, arrows, and the quiet confidence of men familiar with the woods. But the hunt was interrupted when Shrum became separated from his companions. As twilight fell, he realized he had lost his way. By nightfall, Shrum was alone in the dense forest, the temperature dropping as the Sierra night settled in. He was uneasy, but not yet afraid. He decided the best course of action was to wait until morning to retrace his steps. To stay safe from animals, he climbed into a pine tree, wedging himself between branches for the long night ahead. From this vantage point, he could watch the forest floor and rest until daylight. It was from that tree that he noticed something strange in the sky. At first, it was a light, small, distant, unremarkable. But it grew larger, brighter, and soon resolved into a glowing object that hovered above the treetops. Shrum later described it as a craft, metallic and silent, casting beams of light that swept across the forest. His first thought was that it might be a helicopter searching for someone, but the longer he watched, the less it resembled any machine he knew. Then he saw them, figures moving through the forest below, approaching the base of his tree. At first glance, they looked human, but as they stepped into the light, he realized they were anything but. Two beings, short and stocky, clad in metallic suits that glinted under the strange illumination. Their movements were stiff, mechanical, almost robotic. Shrum would later insist they were not biological at all, but some form of robotic entities. Panic surged through him as the figure stopped at the base of his tree, looking up. He clung to the branches, hoping they would leave. Instead, one of the beings began to climb. Terrified, he shouted and waved his arms. In desperation, he drew one of his arrows and fired. The arrow struck the being with a metallic clang, but instead of retreating, it pressed closer. Shrum fired again and again, each arrow bouncing harmlessly off the metal shell. Then came the gas. From below, one of the beings raised a device and released a puff of vapor that drifted upward through the branches. Shrum inhaled it before he could turn away. Almost immediately, his vision blurred. He grew dizzy and lost consciousness. When he awoke minutes later, the beings were still there. He fought back with everything he had, tossing small branches, yelling into the dark, even hurling coins and matches from his pockets. But the figures remained relentless. Over the course of the long night, the struggle repeated again and again. The beings would send gas up toward him, and Shrum would black out. Each time he awoke, he found them still below, patiently waiting. He lost count of how many times he passed out and came to again. At one point, a third figure appeared, taller than the others, cloaked in some kind of silvery suit. Shrum described this one as more humanoid, though his features remained obscured. It seemed to direct the smaller robots, communicating with them in a manner Shrum could not understand. The strange trio kept him trapped in the tree for hours, unable to escape, unable to rest. As the night dragged on, Shrum's fear gave way to exhaustion. He tied himself to the tree with his belt, terrified that he might fall during one of his blackouts. He continued to fire his remaining arrows until none were left. At last, he threw his bow itself, but the figures below did not retreat. They only released more gas, and once again, darkness swallowed him. When the first light of dawn crept into the forest, Shrum awoke to find the beings gone. The clearing was empty. The craft had disappeared. The only evidence of the long, harrowing night were the arrows scattered on the ground and the deep exhaustion etched into his body. He climbed down slowly, shaken but alive. Somehow, he had survived. When he reunited with his companions later that day, they immediately noticed his state. He was pale, trembling, unable to fully explain what had happened. In time, he told them everything. For years, he kept the story mostly private, fearing ridicule. But eventually, under the guidance of UFO researchers, he gave his testimony in detail. His account was consistent, unwavering, and told without embellishment. Skeptics suggested he might have hallucinated the entire event. Exhaustion, isolation, and a fear of being lost in the wilderness could have created visions in his mind, they argued. Others wondered if he had stumbled across experimental military technology, perhaps drones or suits being tested in the nearby region. But those who knew Shrum personally swore by his honesty. He was a man not given to fantasy, nor someone seeking fame. He had no reason to invent a tale so strange. Over the years, the Cisco Grove abduction has remained one of the more bizarre entries in the annals of UFO encounters. Unlike many abduction cases, Shrum did not describe being taken aboard a craft or subjected to medical experiments. Instead, his story was one of combat, a desperate all-night standoff between a lone hunter and entities that seemed determined to capture him. The details, the metallic suits, the gas, the repeated blackouts are unique, standing apart from other accounts of the era. For believers, Shrum's testimony is compelling evidence that the phenomenon is diverse, manifesting in forms beyond the stereotypical gray alien. For skeptics, it is a story too strange to be credible. And yet, as with so many cases, it is the sincerity of the witness that lingers. Shrum never sought profit, never exaggerated his claims. He simply described what he believed had happened, a nightmarish encounter in the Sierra Nevada, one that left him forever changed. In the end, the Cisco Grove abduction remains unresolved. No physical evidence was ever recovered. No corroborating witnesses ever came forward. It exists only in the words of one man, his memory of a night alone in the wilderness. But those words carry the weight of conviction, and they continue to echo across the decades. Whether hallucination, secret experiment, or genuine extraterrestrial contact, the story of Donald Shrum is a reminder of how fragile the boundary is between the known and the unknown. In the stillness of the forest, beneath the watchful stars, a man found himself hunted by something beyond his comprehension. And though he survived, he was left with questions that would never be answered. For those who listen, the tale of Cisco Grove is more than just a story. It is a warning, a mystery, and a glimpse into a reality that may be far stranger than we dare believe.
In the autumn of 1957, in the farmlands of rural Brazil, a young man named Antonio Villas-Boas stepped into the fields to work his tractor. He was 23 years old,
a farmer from the state of Minas Gerais, and by all accounts, an ordinary man. But on the night of October 16th, beneath the vast skies of South America, Antonio would claim an experience that was anything but ordinary. An encounter that became one of the earliest abduction stories of the modern UFO era. For weeks leading up to that night, Antonio had noticed unusual lights in the sky. They appeared as glowing orbs, red and shifting, that hovered above the fields before darting away at impossible speeds. At first, he thought they might be stars, planets, or even aircraft, but their behavior was unlike anything he had seen. The sightings grew more frequent, and with them came a growing unease. On that October evening, Antonio was alone in the fields, working late to escape the heat of the day. As his tractor rumbled across the farmland, he spotted the glow again. This time, it was no distant star. The light descended slowly, deliberately, until he realized it was not hovering far above the earth, but coming directly toward him. He stopped the tractor, heart pounding, as the object came into view. It was a craft, elongated like a cylinder, perched on thin metallic legs as it settled to the ground. Its surface gleamed, bright against the night sky. From its side extended a ramp, and out from the craft emerged figures, humanoid, but not quite human. Antonio panicked. He tried to restart his tractor, but the engine sputtered and died. Abandoning it, he fled across the field, sprinting toward the safety of his farmhouse. But the figures gave chase. They were short, stocky, wearing tight-fitting suits that glistened in the moonlight. Their helmets reflected the glow of the craft. Before he could escape, they caught him, restraining him with unnatural strength. Struggling, Antonio shouted into the empty night, but no one came. The beings carried him up the ramp and into the waiting ship. Inside, the craft was brightly lit, metallic and sterile. Antonio described walls covered with strange symbols, machines whose purposes he could not guess. The beings led him into a small room and began to undress him. Terrified, he resisted, but their strength was overwhelming. They placed him on a table, holding him down as they applied a gel-like substance to his skin. He recalled being pricked by needles, his blood drawn from his chin. They examined him with instruments, touching his body with cold, metallic devices. He could not understand their language, but they communicated with gestures, barking strange sounds to one another. Then, as suddenly as the procedures began, they stopped. The beings left him alone in the room. For long minutes, he sat trembling, unsure of what would come next. Then, the door opened, and another figure entered. A woman. Antonio would later describe her in extraordinary detail. She was unlike the others, taller, with long platinum blonde hair and striking blue eyes. Her features were human-like, yet otherworldly in their symmetry. Her skin was pale, her nose sharp, her face angular. Unlike the others, she wore no helmet. Without speaking, she approached him. The intent was unmistakable. What followed, Antonio claimed, was an intimate encounter. He described her actions as deliberate, as though part of an experiment. She did not kiss him, nor show affection, but she pressed herself against him until he could not resist. He said she made strange noises during the act, barks, growls, almost animalistic. When it was over, she looked at him, pointed to her stomach, then upward toward the sky. The gesture was chilling in its clarity. A child conceived on Earth, destined to be raised elsewhere. Afterward, Antonio was given his clothes and escorted from the room. The beings led him through the craft, showing him various instruments, as though deliberately allowing him to see. He noticed a panel of symbols, which he later tried to sketch for investigators. Eventually, the beings returned him to the ramp. Stumbling back into the night air, he found himself once again in the quiet of his field. The craft lifted silently, rising into the sky before vanishing from sight. Antonio staggered home, shaken and disoriented. When he told his family what had happened, they struggled to believe him. Yet, in the days that followed, physical symptoms appeared. He suffered nausea, weakness, headaches, and lesions on his skin that glowed faintly in the dark. Doctors who examined him noted signs consistent with radiation exposure. His story might have been dismissed as fantasy, but in 1957, the concept of alien abduction was barely known. The famous Betty and Barney Hill case in the United States would not occur until 1961. Antonio's testimony was one of the first of its kind, predating the popularization of abduction lore. For many researchers, this made his account harder to explain away as mere cultural influence. In the years that followed, his case was investigated by Dr. Olavo Fontes of the Brazilian National School of Medicine, and later by international UFO researchers. While skeptics argued that his account was too fantastical to be true, others pointed to the physical evidence of his illness and the consistency of his testimony as signs that something had indeed occurred. Antonio himself never wavered. He stuck to his story for the rest of his life, never seeking fame or fortune from it. In fact, he often expressed frustration that people ridiculed him. He insisted that what he experienced was real, that he had been taken against his will, examined, and used as part of a breeding experiment beyond human understanding. The case became one of the cornerstones of abduction research. It introduced themes that would echo in countless later accounts: the capture, the medical procedures, the communication through gestures, the intimate encounter with an alien being, and the suggestion of hybrid offspring. For many, it was the template upon which modern abduction lore was built. And yet, questions remain. Was Antonio's story the product of imagination, a hallucination triggered by exhaustion or illness? Was it a fabrication designed to attract attention? Or was it, as he always insisted, the truth, a glimpse into an experiment conducted by a species not of this world? What makes his case so enduring is not just the strangeness of the details, but the man himself. Antonio lived an ordinary life, working his farm, raising a family, never profiting from his tale. To those who knew him, he was not a liar, nor someone prone to fantasy. He was simply a man who claimed to have seen and endured something extraordinary. Today, the Antonio Boas case remains one of the most famous abduction accounts in history. It stands at the very beginning of the phenomenon, a story told before alien abduction was a phrase anyone knew. For believers, it is proof that the phenomenon is real, stretching back decades before it entered the public imagination. For skeptics, it is a curious myth, a strange story that refuses to fade. But in the quiet farmlands of Brazil, beneath the wide and star-filled sky, a young farmer once looked up and saw a light descend. What happened afterward may never be fully understood. Yet his story continues to echo, unsettling, unforgettable, and impossible to dismiss. And so, another story of the unknown drifts into silence, unresolved, unexplained, and unforgettable. These encounters remain part of the long transmission of mystery that surrounds us. Thank you for joining this journey into the strange and uncharted. Until the next signal breaks through, this has been End of Transmission.